All right. Well, welcome to Evergreen Reports 101. This is going to be our deep dive into templates. We did about a month and a half ago, end of almost 2 months now, end of November, we did sort of an introductory session on the reporter. So if you were not able to make it to that session, that is recorded and it's up on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to go in and take a look at that at any point to kind of see what we went over there. This session will build off of some of what we talked about in that, but you don't necessarily have to have been through that to understand what's happening in this session. At least I hope not. If there is at any point a question or something that you are maybe a little bit confused about, please feel free to put that in the chat and I will try to address it as we go. I have set aside an hour and a half for this. I don't think it will take the full amount of time, but I do have that time for questions. So feel free to chime in at any point. And I will keep an eye on the chat. And then I also have the rest of the Cardinal team here with me. So they can help me out with answering some questions too. I am not the great expert on reports by any means. So if you stump me, hopefully one of them will be able to fill in the gaps. That's my hope, at least, that we have a full range of knowledge here today. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be really looking into templates, and that is sort of the main kind of meat of what makes reports tricky. As we talked about in our last session, reports are kind of made up of different pieces. There's the template, which is where you select your display fields and figure out what you'll be filtering on. Then there's the report interface, where you actually set those filters and schedule how the report will run and everything like that. And then there's your output, which is the actual data set that you will get from running your report. So today we'll be focusing on that first piece. And we'll be looking at a few different things within the context of those templates. So we'll talk about creating a new template. Those of you who were in our last session may remember that one of the things we talked about was the concept of cloning rather than creating from scratch. And that is still kind of my overall recommendation. If there is an existing template that either your library is already using or that you can find in our centralized reports templates folder, that may be a better starting place than starting from scratch. But there are always going to be those reports that are just a little bit off from anything that's out there already. And there are going to be times when creating a new template is sort of your best option. So this will hopefully give you a little bit of grounding in how to do that. And we'll also go over things that can be applied to the process of cloning if you're going to be creating edits to one of those existing templates. We'll also be talking about the concept of core sources and the different tables that are available. We'll talk a little bit about how those link together. One of the things that I do think causes some confusion with reports is the difficulty of figuring out where the data you're looking for actually lives in the database. So we'll talk a little bit about how to think about that. I don't have all the tables memorized. I don't think anyone has all the tables memorized. So you're not necessarily going to leave this session knowing exactly where to find any piece of data that you need. But hopefully we'll talk a little bit about how to think about what your goals are for the report and how to apply that thinking to choosing the right tables to start from. We'll also talk about display fields. So choosing your display fields is one of the key elements to creating a good report. You want to make sure that all of the data you need is going to come through in your output. So we'll be talking about how to choose the best fields for that. And then within the context of display fields, we'll be talking more in depth about transforms. So we did talk about those in the session back in November, but we'll go into a little bit more detail about what some of those transforms mean in today's session. We'll also talk about setting filters. And within the context of setting filters, we'll talk about operators the same way we would talk about transforms. So we talked about it a little bit in our last session. In this one, we're going to go into more detail about what the different operators do and how you can use them effectively. Now, finally, I will touch briefly on the concept of nullability. This is something that you're unlikely to really use a whole lot of, but you may come across a time when it is necessary. And I do encourage you to, submit tickets or reach out to us for help with that. But I will talk about sort of the concept of nullability and how it works and what it's doing. So at least you kind of understand when one of those times comes, when you're working in a report that could use the nullability feature. So hopefully we'll get through all of this in a relatively efficient manner, but please do let me know if you are lost at any point and we can dig into anything in more detail. So before we get into it, let's just do a quick review of some of what was covered in our last session. So when we're talking about templates, we're basically talking about setting a few different specific things. The first thing that we're setting is our core source, and that's basically the table that we're pulling our data from. So obviously Evergreen is on the back end, it's made up of a bunch of different tables full of data. So every time a circulation transaction happens, that gets recorded in a table. Every patron that's created in your system gets recorded in a table of patrons. And each of those tables is a source that you can pull from when creating a report. The main source that you use when creating your report is called your core source. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that is, and we're going to be doing some exploration of some of those tables. Additionally, the specific categories of data in the output that you get in the spreadsheet that you're creating through the process of creating a report, those are your display fields. So each display field will map to a column within your final output spreadsheet. So I like to think of them as columns in terms of sort of visualizing what I'm doing when putting together my reports. Next, the categories that are used to determine which data points to include are your filters. Basically, you may put together a report that's going to have a column for your home library, your date of creation, and your number of circulations or something like that. The filters would be where you say, I want to make sure that I'm only pulling things from specific libraries, or I'm only pulling things between specific dates. And then the parameters are what you actually fill into those filters. They are saying, the specific library I want is PAC, and the specific dates I want are December 2023 through January 2024. So basically, you're taking a table from our database, you're determining which columns of data to pull from that table into your report. You are deciding what data points you actually care about seeing within that report, and then you are limiting it down to only the ones that are important to you. And that's the general process of reports. Before we get into everything today, are there any questions lingering from the last session, or for those of you who weren't able to attend, are there any questions you may have about sort of the basics of reporting before we go too far? All right, well, let's go ahead and get into the concept of creating new templates. So, as I said in our last session, we did talk about the concept of cloning and the idea that cloning is generally going to be preferable to creating. Anytime you are working off of an existing template, we do ask that you clone it into your account if it's not one that you already own, because when you clone, you're basically taking ownership of a version of that template that you then can control, versus if you run a report off of somebody else's template, it makes it hard for them to make changes to that template. Essentially, it makes it so that they cannot delete that template and create a new template version of it. So we generally ask that you clone rather than run reports off of existing templates that belong to other people. Today, we're going to be talking about creating, though, which is building templates from scratch, and which means that by default, when you create your own report or your own template, that's going to be saved on your account. So let's go ahead and create a new template to get started. We're just going to go into the reporter. So this is the general report interface. We're going to go into the folders and into the templates. And in our last session, we did talk about setting up folders. If you do not yet have template folders set up, you will need to do that before you can start creating templates. So feel free to go back and watch the recording of the last session, or take a look at our knowledge books for information about how to set up those folders. But today I'm going to go into my staff reports folder, and I'm going to click create a new template for this folder. And so this is going to bring me to this blank template. And from here, I can choose my source, I can add my display fields, and I can set up the basics of my filters. Um, so uh, there are a couple of steps that you will need to do every time you create a template. The main one is that you need to give it a name. The template won't save until it has a name. So I'm going to name it for today's session. And one thing that I talked about in the last session and that I use pretty frequently is that if I am creating something from scratch, or if I'm making serious edits to an existing cloned record or clone template, then I will usually put in some sort of like version 1.1 as I'm working with it. That way, as I run something and realize that it's not working properly, or I'm not getting the output I expected, or I am getting the output I expected, but I'd like to add additional things to my template, I can kind of go back and build off of that same report, clone the original one and make it version 1.2 or that type of thing. This is not something you obviously have to do, but I do find that it is an effective way for me to sort of keep track of what I'm doing when I am struggling to get a template that does what I want it to do, which happens pretty often. So if you have to go through versions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that's okay. You are not alone. Don't feel like you are the only one who struggles with that type of thing. So that's really the only thing that you need to have in order to save your template. However, I do recommend that you create a description as well. Our standard at NC Cardinal, and this is what you'll see when you go into our centralized reports templates, is to kind of put the source that we use, the displays that we choose, and the filters that we're using into here. And if there's anything kind of funky about any of those filters, we'll put a little note about it. So you can certainly use that as your typical kind of description, but you can also, set up your own sort of standard for how you create your descriptions, whatever works for you. There's no hard and fast rule about what the description should be, but I do recommend including a description. Now, if you're in the situation where you're creating a report from scratch and you know you're going to be running a few different versions, you might want to put notes about the versions in here. In this version, I added the patron last name field to my template or something like that. That way, if you're doing it over the course of a couple of days, you can kind of trace back through your thinking and figure out what you've tried and what's worked and what hasn't. Um, you also do have the ability, if there is documentation that lives somewhere on the web related to what you're doing a report on, you can put that URL up here in this box. This is not something that we use very heavily at NC Cardinal, but it is available to you if that's something that you'd like to do. So at this point, I'm not going to do any saving because once you save a template, you cannot go back and edit it. So obviously I don't have anything here that I want to run a report off of, so it's not ready to save. And this is a difference between the simple reporter where you can save and then go back and edit. So in a session that we do later on this spring where we look at the simple reporter, we'll talk about that. But for now, we've just got our template name and I'm going to leave it at that. Right. So let's talk next about our core source. Before we do, I know the process of creating the template itself is pretty straightforward, but are there any questions? All right. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is core sources and tables. Creating templates in Evergreen is pretty complex. And one of the things that I think makes it difficult is that it does require a certain amount of understanding of the Evergreen database and how Evergreen handles various records when performing tasks. So anytime you do something within the staff client, that sort of saves that event and it saves it into a table. So whether it is creating a patron account or processing a circulation, placing a hold, any of that information is going to go into an existing table within the Evergreen database. And one of the things that I think is really useful is when you are working with reports, taking the time to plan out your template before getting started. Think about what types of records you'll be reporting on. Are you looking at circulation data? Are you looking at items? Are you looking at bibliographic records? And then think about what information you want to see displayed in your report output. You also want to think about what filters should be used so the report output contains only the records you're interested in. Taking the time to figure out what you need before you start can help direct you as you're actually choosing your source. This understanding, I think, is key to selecting that source because, for example, if you know that you need information about bibliographic records, the type of thing that is stored at the bibliographic record, but you go in and you start your report from the item level table, you'll be able to get to that bib record information, but it'll take a few steps. You'll have to sort of link and sublink again to various tables. It's not the most direct route. And the more steps you take in linking, the more likely it is that your report will fail. So we recommend really thinking about where is the information that I need most likely to be stored? Where's the most central point for it? That way you can do the least amount of linking necessary in order to get the data that you need. So what this comes down to is sort of the concept of core versus non-core sources. So really quick, within the reporter, I'm going to show you in this dropdown for selecting your source, it says core source over here. And at the top of this dropdown, you see core sources. But if you scroll a bit, then you start to see non-core sources. And so what you're really dealing with are the tables that are going to give you the most amount of information for the various different things that you may need to report on versus sort of secondary tables. Basically, core sources are going to have commonly used fields. They're going to be fields that show up in lots of different reports. One really simplified way to think about it is that your core sources are the sources you use the most. But it goes a little deeper than that. I think it's important to think about how the different sources link together. In the last session, we briefly discussed the concept of linking tables, and we're going to talk about that quite a lot today. One of the key differentiators between core and non-core sources is that core sources link out to lots of other tables, whereas non-core sources may only link to one table. They are sort of the product of that linking. So for example, you might have the ILS users table as your core source. And then from that ILS users table, you may link out to the library card table, and that's where you're going to get patron barcodes. But there's nothing else within the library card table that you're necessarily going to need. Most, if you started from the library card table, you'd have to do a lot of linking back to the ILS user table in order to get the display fields that you needed. So it's better to start from ILS user, which happens to link out to this one table as well as several others, versus starting out at the library card table and then having to link back to ILS user multiple times in order to get the data that you need. Basically, core sources are really large tables. They have lots of columns, they hold lots of data, and some of those columns link out to other tables that expand upon the data that's held in that column. So some really commonly used examples of these are ILS users, as well as circulation, hold requests, and items. Non-core sources are less commonly used. They are both fields that don't show up as often in your reports and also tend to be transactions and data points that are kind of very specific to their one tiny function within Evergreen as opposed to being touched by multiple different facets within the software. And as Benjamin put in the chat, if you look at our shared reports at that centralized reports template folder, each of those reports does have the source in the description. So if you look through that list in the knowledge book, you'll see which sources come up over and over again. And that's going to give you a really good idea of what those common sources are. Non-core sources are, as I said, linked to fewer tables, and they are basically what you're linking to rather than something that you might want to link from. Examples of these include the library card one that I mentioned, things like circulation duration rules and copy notes. These are kind of sub information about a piece of information that's held in that larger table. And this will hopefully become clearer as we actually look at it. So for example, ILS users would be a core source. From ILS users, you can link out to current library card, you can link out to mailing address, you can link out to profile permission group. But let's actually take a look at this in the reporter. So if I'm in ILS users, and I actually click on it to open it up in the source path, this tells me basically every column that I could potentially include in my report. And if I look at this little link icon next to them, these are the ones that I would link out to another table to access. And I see that there are several of them. You know, there are some that I could definitely use quite a bit of, like, mailing and physical address, library card, things like that. And also others that I may really not need ever, like secondary identification type. But these are basically pieces of information that I might have to seek out in a secondary table. Whereas if I were to change my core source, let's change it to library card. I'm down here in these non-core sources, and there are a lot of them, so it's a bit of a scroll. So here's library card. And now it does warn me if I start to switch my source in the middle of building a template, I basically am wiping clean everything I've already done. So you can't switch sources in the middle. Once you've chosen one, that's your source. I'll go ahead and click OK in this case, though. I go into library card and I can see there's only one link out. Not only are there way fewer columns available, there's only one that links back, and that links back to that ILS user table that I was in. So you can see that this is sort of an isolated table. It only connects to one other table. And what you really want for your core sources are those tables that have lots of things that link from them. So I hope that makes sense. Basically, you want something that's going to give you lots of information and that you don't have to dig too deep and do multiple links in order to get that information. All right, so let's talk about choosing the right core source for you. The first thing that you need to do is figure out what you need. Do you need a list of every single circulation transaction for the last 3 months? Do you need a list of every patron with a birthday in October? Write that down. Figure out what it is that you're looking for and start from there. Then think about that data. Think about how it's stored. When you create a patron account, you put in their date of birth. So you're going to find all those patrons born in October by going into the patron account. ILS user is probably the correct core source for you. If you're looking for all of the circulation transactions in a specific month, then those circulation transactions are recorded as part of the checkout function within Evergreen. So you're going to want to figure out which table records the checkout function. And the hint on that is it's the circulation table. Try to determine the key point from which most data is connected. And even if you're going to have to link out to other tables, what you want to do is try to reduce the number of times you have to do that, and also reduce the layers you have to go through in order to do that. So we're going to actually start building our template now, and you'll see that in action. All right, so for today's demo, we're going to go ahead and create a circulation report. So let's go into the reporter, and I'm going to switch this again. And I'm going to go up here to circulation. So I get this message again. And what we're going to look at are lost items by the date range in which they were checked out. And then we're going to sort them into categories by shelving location. So that's our goal today. You may notice when you're exploring the centralized reports template that some of the circulation reports start from the item source rather than the circulation source. So that's something that, I think demonstrates this concept of thinking about what your actual goal is with your report. Depending on how much item data you actually need in your report, it may be better to start from an item source rather than the circulation source. If you're looking for things like the title and the barcode and the call number, and item attributes and item tags and things like that, you're probably going to want to start from that item source, and then you can link down to the circulation table from the item source to get a circulation date. Whereas from the circulation table, if you want all of that item information, you're going to have to link out to multiple tables multiple times throughout your report. So really think about, where is this information going to be stored within the database? How is this information created? Is it created by somebody creating an item, an item record, and then at some point that item record circulates, or is it created by the actual circulation transaction? So once we figured out what our core source is, the next thing we want to do is think about how our data fits together. You don't have to have your tables memorized to do this. Instead, think about how Evergreen functions actually create the data. And that's kind of one of the ways that you can figure out, how much linking out you're going to need to do. All right, so our core source for this particular report, we really care about the actual circulation nature of the transactions rather than too much information about the item. I'm not that interested in things like barcode. I do care about where it's shelved. I care about where the circulation happened, but not necessarily who owns the item. And that's a key thing to remember, is that the circulating library and the owning library are not always the same org unit. So that's one of the areas that can get a little tricky. In this case, what I care about is the circulating library. I care about where the circulation transaction occurred, and then I care about, did this circulation transaction result in a book being marked lost? Those are the two questions that I'm trying to answer with this report. So let's go ahead, and we've set our circulation core source. And from here, if I click on circulation, I'm going to see all of the columns that are available to me. And there's quite a few of them. It's a core source. It's one of the big tables. So there's a lot of here. I do see several different things that I can link out to. Hopefully this kind of covers all of my needs, and I don't have to do too much linking beyond that. So at this point, I've chosen my source. The next thing I need to do is figure out what I actually want to show up in my report. Which columns, which of these options in this source path over here, do I want to actually see in my output? So the next thing we're going to talk about then is display fields, and then how to manipulate those using transforms. So when we're setting up our display fields, there are a couple of different things that we want to think about besides just which columns to show up in our final output. We want to think about our sort order. We want to think about how things are going to be counted if it's a counting report, which ours will be today. We also want to think about our column names. And finally, we want to think about what the data actually looks like in each individual cell, and that would be the transform. So for today's report, we are going to be looking for a few different display fields. The first one that we're going to look at, and this is a common one that you'll use a lot, will be the org unit. Now, I did say a few minutes ago that there is something that there's a difference between the circulating library and the owning library, that those two aren't always the same. Resource sharing can result in a circulation happening very far away from the branch that actually owns an item. So think about, what is it that you care about when you're putting together a report? Do you care about who owns something? Do you care about where the circulation happened? For this particular report, I care about where it happened. So for that, I'm going to figure out the checkout and renewal library. Now that is an option right here in my source path. But if I look at the icon next to it, I see this tree. Now, you may not know this yet, but I know that if I see this tree, what I'm going to get in my display is the database ID number of the org unit that the report selects. And that's not going to be terribly meaningful for me. So what I really want to see is the library's short name. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to link out. So if you are trying to include your library's name, and you include it from something that has the tree icon, you're probably not going to get the actual name. You're going to get a 3-digit code. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on this arrow next to circulation, and we're going to scroll down to the subtable that is checkout renewal library. So it's labeled the same thing, but by doing that, I'm able to actually open up all of the information that is stored in the table related to that database ID number for that org unit. And from here, I can find the thing that has the letter A next to it. That means this will be a text field, and that's what I want. I want something that's going to come up as text. So in this case, I'm going to get the library's actual name. So I'm going to select that, and I'm going to go ahead and add it as my display field. We're not going to talk about transforms just yet, so I added it as raw data right now. We can come back and change that in a little bit. All right, so the next thing that I want to include is item location. So this is the shelving location. This is where the item is shelved within the library. And I can do a few different things with this. In this report, what I really want is to be able to categorize my books by their shelving location, and they get a count for each location within each branch that I include in my report. So if I'm looking at every branch within Appalachian, I then want to look at every shelving location within each individual branch. So I may get adult fiction at Pack and adult fiction at Black Mountain and adult fiction at West Asheboro, South Asheboro, Asheville, sorry. So I'm going to get a number of different sort of subcategories in my final report. In order to do that, what I want to find is my location. So I'm going to scroll through in the circulating table. I'm going to scroll through until I find location, shelving location. It's right here. And I see that it has the link icon next to it, which means I don't want to add this. Instead, I want to find the shelving location table that is listed as a subtable under circulation. So I'm going to come down here to find the same label, shelving location, and click on that, and that's going to open up the full shelving location table for me. So from there, I can choose the individual columns that I'd like to display. So I'm going to choose name again. And again, I'm just going to put that in as raw data. We can always change that later. And so now I know that I'm pulling information about where an item was checked out, and I'm pulling information about where it is shelved. The next thing that I want to do is figure out all of the items that circulated that are lost. And this one's a little tricky. This is one of those that unless you know it, you're probably not going to guess it. So I'll just let you know that one of the best ways when you're working within the circulation table to discover lost items as part of sort of a circulation transaction is to go under circulation and find stop reason. So regardless of whether a library actually charges fines, every library has fines accrue on any transaction that goes overdue. Those fines may accrue at a rate of $0 per day, and so therefore there's nothing actually charged to the patron. But in terms of how the software is reading it, Evergreen is reading it as fines are accruing until something happens to make that stop. Now that can stop by a renewal, it can stop by the item being checked in, or it can be stopped by the item being marked lost. So one of the easiest ways when you're working within a circulation table while doing a report to find the things that were marked lost as a result of a transaction is to go into find stop reason and then filter that down to fines that were stopped because the item was marked lost. So I'm going to choose find stop reason, and I'm just going to go ahead and add that as well as raw data. All right, one more display field that I want to add at this point, we may come back and add a few more later on, is the count. So I want to count the number of circulations for each of these categories. The way that I'm going to do that is under circulation, I am going to find circulation ID or circ ID, and then I'm going to enter that in my transforms as a count. And we'll talk about what these transforms are in just a minute. But basically, each time an item is checked out, Evergreen records that as a single transaction and it applies an ID to it. And each ID is unique. So every single circulation transaction for any item within the entire consortium will have a unique ID for that specific circulation transaction. So what I can do is that I can look at how many circulation IDs happened on items that fit the rest of my parameters. So if I'm looking at items that checked out as a specific library that belong to a specific shelving location and had a specific find stop reason, I can count the number of unique circ IDs connected to those categories. So that's what I'm going to add here to get my count. Is everybody with me so far? All right. I thought you were just really excited that you were following along. So no problem on the caps lock. All right. So we've decided which display fields we want to use, at least for now. The next thing that we need to do is figure out how we actually want those to display. When we actually get our output, what is this going to look like? Is it going to be exactly as we have it listed here, or do we want to manipulate it a little bit further? So in order to do that, we want to think about how it's sorted. We want to think about what's being counted specifically. We want to also make sure that our column names are readable, and we want to apply transforms to any data that we'd like to appear different in our output than it's stored in the database. So the first thing we'll talk about is sort order. Basically, when you're talking about sort order, you're talking about first which order the columns appear in, and then you're talking about how the data is sorted within those columns. So if you think about an Excel spreadsheet, you can have 5 different columns and you can sort by the third column. And you can say, the third column is text-based, so you can sort it alphabetically. And then all of the other columns will sort along with that to give you the data you want in that order. Unfortunately, the reporter does not allow you to sort in any way different than the columns that you have ordered. So not a huge deal with sort of list reports, because you can take that Excel file and download it, and then you can change the sorting however you want. But when we're talking about count reports, the count is going to be based in part on how things are sorted. So we want to make sure that we're kind of starting with the biggest umbrella and moving down in terms of how we're sorting. So if the thing we care about the most is which library something was checked out at, that needs to be the first column, the leftmost column, because that's going to be the first thing to be sorted. And then within that sort, it'll next sort by the shelving location. And within that shelving location, next it will sort by the find stop reason. I can change this around by saying, actually, what I care about is the shelving location, and I can move this field up. Basically, I can right click on the line that I'd like to move up. I can click move field up, and now shelving location is going to be our leftmost field. You can see your sort order here in the far left. And so if you have a lot of display fields, this is very helpful. With only 4, you can kind of tell. But if you've got, 10 or 11, it's helpful to have this number, because then you can really visualize what it's going to look like. And then these will apply to columns when it's actually you get your output. So column 1 will be circulation shelving location. Column 2 will be checkout renewal library. Column 3 will be find stop reason. And then column 4 will be the actual count. And that count will be for basically everything that came before it. I actually don't want shelving location to be first, so I'm going to move it back down. So you can always do that as well by just choosing move field down from that same drop down. So this actually connects right into that idea of a count umbrella. So when including a count, not only is sort order really important because the data is going to be counted based on the categories it's grouped into, but you also want to make sure that your count is the last field. If I put my count up front, I'm going to get 1 for everything, because the only thing that it's basing it on is each circulation ID. And if I have, circulation ID 119735, I've only got one of those, so that's what it's going to count. So you want to make sure that if you're doing a count, that that's going to come last in your order here. The next thing to think about are column names. So sort order, as I said, may not matter a lot if you're doing a list because you can always sort it in Excel after downloading it. If you're not doing a count report, then you don't have to think about the count umbrella. But almost every report, you're going to need to think about your column labels because you can see here that I've got two columns labeled the same thing. I have the name of my checkout renewal library and I have the name of my shelving location. And when I get my output, the only thing I'm going to see in those column labels is name. Now, it should be pretty clear which one's which by looking at it, but there are some where it's not quite as clear. So you definitely want to make sure that you're taking the time to change these labels. So once again, I'm going to do a right click on the fields that I want to change, and I'm going to choose Change Column Label. And so for this one, this is my checkout library. So I'll click OK, and now this is going to appear as checkout library rather than name. And I'll do the same thing on my shelving location. Change column label and rename this shelving location. Oh, I don't need to do that for my find stop reason. That's clear what it is, but you may want to just to make more sense with what you're actually trying to do. So, I could change this to lost status since that's what I'm really looking for. So that's up to you how, if this is a report just for you, then you can make these as descriptive as you need to be able to read it. If you're going to be sharing this report with a lot of other people, you probably want to make them pretty descriptive. And then I will change circ ID to number of circulations. So this is going to help help make my output a little more readable. All right, and so the final thing that we want to talk about now are transforms. Transforms we did touch on in our last session, but it's something that I do think causes a lot of confusion. So that's something that I do want to spend some time on today. Before we do, any questions about anything else we've done about sort order or adding the display fields or anything like that? All right, so let's go ahead and come back into our slides. And let's talk about transforms. So what are transforms? Transforms are basically how you transform the data to appear the way you want it to. If you choose raw data, which of course is the default, and that's what most of our stuff is here, then you're going to see in your output exactly how something is recorded in the database. And there are some things for which that's perfectly fine. If you're looking at a list of the names of org units, that's exactly what you need. It's just the library name. There's nothing wrong with the raw data. If you're looking at a timestamp for a circulation transaction, you're going to be getting down to the second. And that is a problem for two reasons. One, it's probably not really what you care about in your report, so it's just more information than is necessary and kind of creates an overload. Two, if you're trying to do something like filter or do a count based on a date, then the timestamp is not very useful because each timestamp down to the second means that you're going to have very few transactions that happen at the exact same time. So if you're looking for a count of things that happened on a single day, you really want to transform that data from a timestamp to an actual date, because otherwise you're going to get a count of the things that happened each second. And that's not going to be terribly useful. That's basically just going to be a list. So it's important to think about what you want your data to actually look like when you get it and how you want to work with it. And that's going to impact what your displays are. So there are a lot of different transforms available. We won't necessarily cover all of them, but there are a few that I think are really helpful and probably the most common. So those are the ones listed here on this slide. The raw data is the default. It is basically data exactly as it appears in the database, and this is not unuseful. This is something that probably a lot of your display fields will be. The other one, the one that you'll probably change the most, is the date, because the timestamp just really isn't terribly useful. The date transform allows you to change that timestamp into a more readable date. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. So let's come back into our template and let's add a date display field so we can take a look at some of the different date options available. I'm trying to move this box. All right. So under circulation, you can see here in my source path that I have a lot of different date options. I have check-in time, I have scan time, which should be about the same as the check-in time, but there are two different identifiers for it. We have checkout time, we have due date, we have find stop, we have record creation, and we have transaction finish. So a lot of different options. For this particular report, what I'm really trying to find is the number of circulations that happened between specific dates. So what I really care about are checkout times. So that's the one that I'm going to choose. I'm going to come up here to checkout date time. I'm going to deselect my circ ID because you can select multiple of these at once, and it's going to give you every transform available for anything that's that you've selected here, and that could get a little confusing. So I'm making sure that I only have checkout date time selected, and this gives me the list of every transform available. So I have, raw data. I have a couple of these others that we'll talk about in a moment, and then I have a lot of different things I can do with a timestamp. I can choose day of week. So if you wanted to say get a report to figure out which day of the week on average has the most number of circulations, you could do that where you're listing, the dates by the day of the week it happened. And so you could get a count of every circulation on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc., and see which days on average have the most. Day of month, so you could do the same thing, but you're actually looking at a date within a month, or a date within a year. Figure out what is the busiest date within an entire year for circulation for your library. You can also look at weeks, so you can do the same sort of thing, but kind of look at it at a weekly level rather than a daily level. And then month, and this is a fairly common one, I think. This is different than year plus month. So month of year means that you can look at it over the course of many years, and you can get sort of totals for all months of February. So you're going to get, if you look at it over the course of 5 years, you'll get the total for February of every February over those 5 years added up. Whereas year plus month, you're going to get February 2019, February 2020, February 2021, etc. So it's going to actually break it down by the year plus the month. So just a distinction to make. With some of our financial reports, you might want to use the quarter of year as well. That can also be useful. It's going to be doing the same thing as your day or week or month, and looking at it, and however big your window is, your date range, it'll cover all of those years, but it'll look at the quarters within them. You can also get an idea of, what your trends are throughout the day by looking at hour of day. So you can run this report and see, 2 o'clock is the busiest day over the course of your, or the busiest time over the course of a year, something like that. The most common one is just date. So this takes that timestamp and it cuts off the time part of it, and so it just gives you the date. So if I have a circulation on January 16th at 2 p.m., instead of telling me the exact time it happened, it's only going to say January 16th, 2024. So that's probably the most common option of all of these different date options. Year plus month is also fairly common when people just sort of want to see what were our circulations every month over the course of the last year. This is a good way to do that. And then year is useful as well if you're just trying to get a picture of a full year. You can get real granular and get down to the hour. It doesn't go any more than that. You can't get down to the second. Using this, the raw data will get you down to the second though, so you do have that option if you care to use it. I'm not personally really sure what the difference between day name and day of week is. I don't think I've ever run a report with day name, but if anyone's curious and would like to experiment with that, I'd be happy to learn more about it. Same thing with month name. And then these three down here, age, months ago, and quarters ago, these are really useful when doing various types of recurring reports. Basically, you can, when you're doing a recurring report, you can set up your recurrence using relative dates. And we talked about that in the last session, but you can also set it up within the template by using these specific transforms. So you could say, set your filter to use months ago as your transform and then set a filter for 3 months. And then every time that report runs, it's going to just look at 3 months ago what happened. So that's something that you can do. I think it's a little bit easier to set it up using relative dates, but this is an option. And if that works for you and makes sense for you, then feel free to continue using it. So those are basically your date options. In this particular case, I'm going to add, I think I'm going to actually add year plus month to my display field. So I'm going to add that here. And obviously we don't want it last because we want our number of circulations to be last. But what I'm actually going to do is move it all the way up to the front. So what's going to happen is that I am going to have a report that counts every item for each month within the date range I select. So it's going to look at, say, December, everything at this branch within this shelving location that was marked lost. How many? And then it's going to look in the same thing that same month, but for the same branch and a different shelving location. And then that same month, different branch, shelving location, count. So it's going to do that. And basically my first sort is going to be by the month. So I'll be honest, I didn't test this when I was practicing for today. So we'll see if it actually works. It should work though. So those are our dates. Are there any questions about dates? All right, so let's go on and talk about some of the transforms that we can add to, let's talk about some of the transforms that we can add to text-based fields. So we can do a lot of different things. We can do a lot of different things with text. And I think some of them are more useful than others. Some of them really impact the way the report actually functions, and some of them are just aesthetic. So uppercase and lowercase are a little bit of both. Uppercase is generally going to be aesthetic. It's something that you can apply when you are just trying to make something more readable. There are, as I go through different tables and things like that, I notice that some libraries will put patron names in all caps when they're creating a patron record, and others will do regular sentence case for that. So you could make your report more readable and more sort of consistent by just saying, I'm going to put all patron names in uppercase and applying that transform to a patron name field. In certain cases, particularly when you're applying transforms to filters, the uppercase and lowercase can actually be helpful in helping you to create more uniform data so that your counts are correct and your filters are correct. If you're filtering on patron names and some are uppercase and some are lowercase, then transforming everything to uppercase before you filter on it means that the filters will be applied uniformly regardless of case. So it's mostly aesthetic, but it can have some function within the reports. Continuous non-space string is really useful in certain cases. Basically what this does is it pulls out the first word of a multi-word data field. So for example, in our current report, we are going to be looking at shelving location. And of course, our shelving locations are often things like adult fiction and juvenile fiction. If we wanted to sort of lump these in a little bit together and have all adult materials and all juvenile materials and all young adult materials counted as sort of their each category, sort of a meta category rather than each individual shelving location, we could change our shelving location, transform from just the raw data, which will be the shelving location as it's listed like adult fiction, to first contiguous non-space string. And what that's going to do is it's going to pull up adult. So it's going to first filter or first categorize by date, then by library, and then by anything where the shelving location starts with the word adult. That's what is going to be counted. So if you wanted to sort of do some lumping like that, this particular transform can be useful. And then, of course, we've already applied count to our circulation ID field. So there are two different types of count. There's count and there's count distinct. Now, when you're working with the circulation transaction IDs, every single circulation transaction ID is unique. Therefore, there will be no difference between the count and the count distinct. However, if you wanted to see, how many patrons you have with the first name Catherine, you could do a count distinct, and that's going to basically count only one patron named Catherine versus count, which is going to count every single person with the first name Catherine. I'm trying to think of a better example than that. That's not very good. So you could do maybe a report of active patrons who borrowed items at a library. Each patron would be counted sort of once. If you use the count distinct, each patron would be counted once, even if they borrowed multiple items, whereas a count would count every single circulation transaction that they make. So you would get this person on this date had this circulation, and therefore that's one. Whereas the count distinct would say this person is a distinct unit and has borrowed and is only being counted one time as that distinct unit, regardless of how many transactions they've had. Does that make more sense? Yes. So Deborah's pointing out that count distinct would be for unique patrons. I have a really hard time verbalizing this one. All right, so the next two to talk about also are the min and the max. And basically, max compares the value in the field of all result records, and then it returns the one record with the highest value. So if you were creating a list report rather than a count report, and you only wanted to see the most recent transaction in each category we've created, so the most recent thing that was checked out from, a specific branch and a specific location that ended up lost, then you could use max to get only a list of the most recent one that happened to, as opposed to each individual one. And then min would do the same thing, but opposite. It would choose the oldest one, the smallest one. So those are basically your transforms. And the most common ones to use are date related. Beyond that, you can get a lot of useful things and a lot of aesthetic things by applying some of these others. If you are struggling with transforms, I would suggest create the most basic version of the report that you can, and then go back in and try adding different transforms to figure out what is going to get you closest to what you're looking for, rather than trying to add everything at once. You're less likely to break the report that way. You're also more likely to kind of understand what it is you're seeing if you're doing it one thing at a time. So that's basically display fields. So this is what will come up in the output in terms of the columns and categories that we have, and in terms of what the data within those categories looks like. The next thing we need to figure out is our filters. Which rows of data will actually show up in the report? Because if we just ran this report as is, we would end up with, every account of every transaction within each shelving location at every single library back to the beginning of Cardinal. It would be a very long report. It wouldn't be done running for quite some time, and it would be probably too large to be useful. So we want to kind of filter that down. Um, are there any questions about transforms before we move on to filters? All right, so with filters, the first thing we need to think about is which filters we actually need. So if you recall from the last session, we talked about display fields kind of as the way to select our columns and filters as the way to select our rows. And they does that by giving the reporter parameters about what type of data to include in that final report. There are two steps to filters. In the template, you tell the reporter what fields to filter on, and in the report step, you set the actual parameters that you're checking those fields against. It is possible to set up some of the filters in the template directly, so those parameters that you would add in the report step, you can add in the template step, and we will talk about that in a moment. Generally speaking, that is not my recommendation. There are a couple of exceptions to sometimes when it is useful, and so we're going to look at a time that it would be useful. But generally speaking, I would suggest not hard coding the filters. We're going to start by determining which fields we actually want to filter on. So just as we started by setting our display fields by thinking about what we wanted our report to look like, in this case, we need to think about the information we're actually interested in receiving back. We know our output is going to include columns for the date of checkout, for the checkout library, for the shelving location, for the status, specifically lost, and for the number of circulations. And in order to get that, what we need to do is filter the specific subset of values for each of those fields that we want included in that final count. So we want the count of circulations for specific dates, for specific libraries, for specific shelving locations. So we're going to do that in the filters tab here. For the circulating library, we want to be able to count the circulations for individual branches. So let's add checkout renewal library here as one of our filters. Now, when we added the display field, we went into the subfield or the subtable for checkout renewal library, and we pulled out the library name. For the filter, we don't need to do that. We can use this org unit here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to add it as raw data. And I'm just going to go ahead and put it in my filters now. We're going to come back here and we're going to talk about operators in a moment, but for now, I'm just going to add it. Next, we're going to think about our shelving locations. So we care about shelving locations. Do we want every single shelving location? Do we want just specific ones? So for example, if you're only interested in seeing a count of items in juvenile shelving locations, you could filter on that field. In this particular case, I'm not going to do that. We use that first contiguous transform in our display version of this. So this was our transform here. And because we did that, we've sort of manipulated this data a bit already. It's not a filter. It's kind of the opposite of a filter. It's more of a grouping. So we've grouped all of the things together based on what the first word in the shelving location is. And that's going to impact how the count works. So I'm not going to filter any further than that. I'm just going to leave that one off. The next thing that we need is the find stop reason. And this is probably the most key thing that we could do for this particular report in terms of filtering, because what we're really trying to get here is a count of items that were marked lost. And in order to do that, we have to filter for those items that were marked lost. Otherwise, we're just going to get a list of, we're just going to get a count of everything, and that's not going to be terribly useful. So I'm going to come in my circulation path. I'm going to come down here to find stop reason, and I'm going to go ahead and add that to my filters. And in a moment, we're going to set that filter. So I'll show you how you can hard code a filter with this one. And then we also want a date filter. So I do want to kind of confine this to specific dates. So I'm going to go with my checkout date and time, and I'm going to add that as well. So I now have all of the things that I plan to filter on. Now I need to figure out what those filters are actually going to do and how they're going to function. So part of that will be setting transforms, and part of it will be setting operators. And then for one of them, it's going to be setting the filter value itself. So for our first filter, checkout renewal library, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to leave it as raw data, but I am going to change its operator. So I'm going to click on it and I'm going to right click and choose change operator. And for this, I'm going to change this to in list. And so basically what that means, our default operator is always equals. And let's actually go in and take a look at this real quick. So operators are basically how two pieces of data are compared to each other. So, all of this data exists within the table. And then the reporter's job is to go in and pull out the specific pieces of data that meet your needs. And it does that by looking at the filter you set and comparing it to what's in the table and saying, does this equal that? Then I will include it. Does my circulating library match the circulating library that they have set in their filter? Then it will be included. If it does not, it will not be included. And that's what equals does, and that's your default. But for something like our circulating libraries, we might want to include more than one. This is especially useful if you want to see all of the branches within your system. So for that, we want to use in list, because this way we can give it a list of different branches to check against, and it can say, does the piece of data within the table match this branch? No. Well, does it match this branch? No. Does it match this branch? Yes, I will include it. So even though it was no to the first two, it was yes to the third, and therefore it gets included. So in list is really useful at the org unit level. It's also useful for things where you might want to include more than one potential match. So shelving location or circ mod or something like that. If you want to look at a lot of different things, in list is very useful. Even if you think you're probably only going to want to use one, but it's possible that in the future you'll run a report that looks at more than one, you can set in list, but only put one thing on that list. So in general, if you have a sort of finite list of things to choose from, I would say in list is a better choice than equals across the board. So I usually change my operator, if nothing else, to in list, unless it's something that is sort of an infinite list that doesn't have a designated kind of a readable list. So I would not choose in list for barcodes, for example, because that list would be very long and not terribly useful to me. So in this case, I'm going to choose in list for my org units. For my find stop reason, I want it to stay as equals because I'm going to give it a very specific parameter to check against. Let's go ahead and set that parameter now. I'm going to do that by setting my filter value. You can see that here in this last column, it's blank across the board. The filter value is normally set at the reporter interface, but you can hard code it into the template, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose change filter value. And I'm just going to write in lost. I'm going to put it in all caps. Now I could, if I wasn't sure if that information was stored in all caps or lowercase or something else, I could change my transform from raw data to uppercase. And that way, when I write my filter in uppercase, the data that it's checking against has been transformed to all uppercase. Now, I happen to know that this particular piece of data is in all caps, so I wouldn't necessarily need to do that, but I can do that sort of as a catch-all. Now, this is something that I don't recommend doing often. If there's a very specific thing that you're looking for, like in this case, our find stop reason is lost, then it makes sense to hard code it. But generally speaking, you want to be able to set the filters at the report level as much as possible in order to make the template as useful across different needs as possible. So you kind of want to keep the template relatively generic, and then you can set your filters more specifically at the report level. And then finally, our checkout date. I'm going to change this one quite a bit. I'm going to first change our transform from a timestamp to a date. And then I'm going to change my operator from equals to between, and this allows me to set a date range. So that's going to be helpful for me so that rather than having a single date that I'm checking against, I can say that I want to check against all circulation transactions for the last 2 months or for the last 3 weeks. I have a lot of leeway on exactly how I want to set that up. So date is a very useful transform here, and between is a very useful operator here. I could do other things, but this is, I think, the best way to set dates in most cases. So for the most part, we have set our filters up the way we want them to. We know what fields we're filtering on. We have transformed the data to appear the way we want it to and to check against the database we want it to in the way that we want it to. We have set operators so that we know exactly how it's going to check against the database. And for the one thing that we did want to hard code a filter, we've gone ahead and done that. So I think at this point, our report is ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to run it, and it'll run in the background while we talk about our next thing. So to run it, I'm going to come here to my template staff reports folder, and I'm going to find the one that I just created. It's up here at the top. And I'm going to create a new report from selected template. And I will just name it the same thing the template is named in this case. And I'm going to choose staff reports to save it in. Again, this goes back to what we talked about last time. And I'm just going to go ahead and choose all of Bunkum's branches to include. That's all right with Bunkum. The dates that I'm going to look at, because we are looking at items that have had time to be marked lost, I do want to go back a little ways. I'm going to go back to October. And I'm just going to run it through today. My guess is that there's nothing that was checked out yesterday that's already been marked lost, but I'll include it. And you can see that that hard code filter that we created is here. I can't change this. I can't do anything to it, but it lets me know that that filter is being applied. Another one where you'll see hard coded a lot is deleted. So if you're running, an item report and you don't want to include deleted items in that report, then you might want to hard code a filter for deleted equals false. That's a very common hard coded filter. I'm not setting up any kind of recurrence. I just want to do it once. So I'm going to go ahead and save it, and this will run in the background, hopefully, while we talk about the next thing. In the meantime, are there any questions about filters? All right, I'm going to move on, but if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will address them. The last thing I wanted to talk about is nullability. Now, nullability is complicated. It breaks reports left and right. It rarely gets you what you're looking for the first time because it's hard to understand. At least that has been my experience, and in talking with other people, seems to be other people's experience. Generally speaking, if you think you need nullability, I'd recommend that you submit a ticket and we will work with you on getting your report with nullability set up. But if you want to practice with it, by all means, if you can become a nullability expert, that would be a powerful thing to be. So what is nullability? Nullability is a feature within reports that allows you to select which tables can return null values in your output and which can't. So, there are certain pieces of data that can be stored in the database as null, meaning that there's simply nothing there. So for those circulation transactions we were just looking at, they have an exact start time. Those of them that are still checked out do not have an exact finish. That particular column within their table would be null for that circulation ID because it's still checked out. It hasn't finished. So there's nothing there. If I were to run a list of transactions that checked out on a certain date, many of those that were returned would come back with a null value for when they finished. I could use nullability to remove those items. Now, in that particular report, there are easier ways to do that, but that's sort of a a fairly easy example to wrap your head around. Basically, the nullability that you select determines how tables are linked together. You can select none nullable, which basically means that null values in both tables will be left out of the report. So if you're linking between circulation and item ID, any null values between the two, that row will just not be included. So you won't get a null for that one. Parent nullable means that only null values in the parent table, so the higher level table, will be included in the report. So if that parent table has null values, your output will reflect that. But if the table you link to has null values, those will not be included in your output. Child nullable is the opposite. Only null values in the child table would be included. Any null values in the parent table would not be included. Some tables do have nullability set by default in the database itself. So you'll notice if you go into the reporter, let's come back here to our templates, and I'm going to look at a nullability template that I created for this. You'll notice it is version 4 because it did take me 4 versions to get one that worked properly. So, you know, if it takes you 4 versions to figure something out, you're doing just fine. So when I go into my source, my core source, I have the ability to check nullability here at the top. And if I check that, I'll see in these drop downs that they're all set to default. That means whatever the database will do with this table by default is what's going to happen. Generally speaking, you want to leave that alone. You don't want to use nullability. And if you do, you want to leave it as default. But I could come down here to, so the example that I have here is with copy tags. So I could come down to copy tags. I could open it up. I could select the table I want, and I could set this to be none nullable. And that's what I've done here. That's what has been added here in my display field. So just to kind of think about what that looks like, if I were to run the template I was just showing without nullability added, and so I've got copy tags here, I run it just like that, what's going to happen is that my output is going to have a lot of blanks because most items don't have copy tags. And if I'm interested in just getting a list of items with copy tags and what those copy tags are, most of my report is going to be useless to me because most of it's going to be blank. I could go into Excel and I could sort that particular field, and then I could delete all the empty ones, and that would work too. But if I want to sort of not have to worry about that step, I could use nullability to get rid of all of these empty fields and get a report that only has items with item tags attached to them in the final output. So in the reporter itself, I can basically fix this issue by doing the exact same thing I had, the exact same set of display fields, except on this fourth one, this item copy tags tag, adding nullability. And in this case, I've added none nullable to make sure that that none of the null values are being carried over. And so I could run this report. And I'm not going to run off of this one because it's the exact same one I've already done, but I will show you the output of that one. So let's go into my output, and it looks like our report from earlier has finished, so we'll look at that as well. Let's go into our nullability test 5. So this is the version where I have added nullability. Prior to adding nullability, we had blanks. Now that we've added nullability, you can see that I only have these, you know, 7 items that happen to have a tag attached to them. That's the only thing that's come up in my report. So nullability is not something that I think that you need to mess with in most cases, but if you are running a report and you're getting a lot of blank values where you expect to find things, nullability is sort of the key to fixing that. Feel free to reach out to us when that happens, and we will help you set it up. You're also welcome to experiment with it yourself, but be aware that you may have to run a few different versions of it to find the exact nullability setup that works. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick look at our output from our report earlier. And you can see that it worked because this bar chart's here. It's not a very useful bar chart, but it's here. And I have basically October 2023, Black Mountain, all adult, 40 circulations resulted in lost. Same month, same branch, shelving locations with the tag of easy. Now, of course, this is going to be that should be lumped in with juvenile, so that contiguous substring isn't necessarily going to work across the board in this case, but I could add these together and get 77 easily. And then all of my young adult resulted in 3. So that's nice that teenagers are the most responsible library users. And then I see that for each branch, again, the shelving location sort of groupings are going to be the same across the board, and I'm getting the count for those items that are lost for each of these. And if I keep scrolling, I'm going to eventually get to November 23, same set, and then December 2023, same set. So basically by doing a variety of things with transforms and operators, I was able to get this sort of nice list of counts based on month, branch, grouping of shelving locations, and specifically items that were marked lost as the result of a circulation transaction, which was my goal. So that basically comes to the end of what I had for today. Are there questions? And if you've got questions about things that were maybe covered in an earlier session that you didn't attend or were still confused about, welcome to ask those now as well. Yes, the first part is on YouTube. In fact, I can grab that link for you and put it in the chat here. Oh gosh. All right, so there is the link to the YouTube video for the first session. Let's see, Andrew asked if there are restrictions on who can and cannot generate new reports. At NC Cardinal does not have those restrictions. Reports are available to anyone who has a staff login account. So there are specific accounts that are given report permissions. Those are actually limited accounts that don't allow you to do anything except run reports. And that is something that you can set up for your library and have that as the main reporting hub. But every account from a circulator all the way through to a system admin does have report permissions. Let's see. Deborah is asking about a report to find expired patrons prior to a certain date that owe no money, and then those that owe below a certain threshold with the total old over them 3 years. Yes, there is a difference between total old and total billed. Total billed is the amount that was originally billed. Total owed is the amount remaining. And there may be further distinctions. The billing tables are very complex. There may be a further distinction as well between balance owed and total owed, having to do with if anything was forgiven. I would have to play around with that a little bit to figure out the exact distinctions there. The billing tables are complicated. But yes, there is a difference between those two. And if you're looking at what is still owed, um, I would go with total owed rather than total billed, because total billed may be showing up even after a transaction has been partially cleared. And feel free to submit that as a ticket if you'd like to dig into it more, because as I said, billing tables can be tough to work with. How should money be defined in reports? Deborah, what do you mean by that precisely? Ah, oh, yes, it would be defined with no dollar sign and with two decimal places. So no, you wouldn't include the dollar sign. A good way to test for that, or for really anything where you're not exactly sure, is to run it where you don't set the filter for that yet. And run it where you have a column that shows an amount that's just raw data, and however it shows up in that column, that's how you would set it within the filter. And I'm pretty sure it's no dollar sign, and it is decimal place and uh, two places after that. But you might want to just go ahead and run that and make sure, because I usually don't run billing reports. I usually do that in the directly in the database. So I'm not 100% certain on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining me. Oh, uh, yeah, Evergreen reports are a challenge, and part of that is just the way the data is stored is a little bit complex, and part of it is just the interface for the reporter is not the most user-friendly interface. But it's powerful, and there's a lot you can do with it. It is a challenge. That's a good word for it. But um, yes. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here. I will get a recording of this processed and up. My experience with the last few of these is that that does take a few days. Captions, especially, are time consuming, but I will do what I can to get it up as quickly as possible. If you have questions in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to me directly or via Basecamp, or submit a ticket if you have a question about a specific report you're working on. But I'm happy to help you as you continue to move forward in your reports journey. So thank you.